The grounded Thunderbolt. The morning sun blazed over the Pacific airfield, turning the metal surfaces of parked aircraft into mirrors of blinding light. Staff Sergeant Tommy Rizzo wiped the sweat from his brow and squinted at the massive Republic P-47 Thunderbolt sitting on the tarmac like a wounded bird. Its propeller hung still, defiant against the urgent needs of war. "She's been down for 3 days now," said Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. 3 days, Rizzo. We need every plane in the air, not sitting here like expensive lawn ornaments. Tommy nodded, understanding the weight behind those words. It was June 1944, and the Pacific Theater was hungry for aircraft. Every grounded plane meant one less sortie against Japanese positions, one less escort for the bombers heading north. The P-47, affectionately called the Jug by its pilots for its barrel-shaped fuselage, was a workhorse when it worked. "What's the problem, sir?" Tommy asked, though he'd already heard the rumors circulating through the maintenance crews. "That's the hell of it. Nobody knows," Morrison said, frustration bleeding through his normally composed demeanor. "Engine starts fine, runs smooth for about 5 minutes, then just dies. Every damn time. We've had our best mechanics on it. Changed the fuel lines, checked the ignition system, cleaned the carburetor, replaced spark plugs, everything by the book. Nothing works." Tommy approached the aircraft, running his hand along the fuselage. The P-47 was a beast of a fighter plane, weighing over 7 tons and powered by the mighty Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double wasp engine. With 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, it was one of the most powerful engines in any fighter aircraft. It was also, Tommy knew from experience, one of the most temperamental when something went wrong. "May I take a look, sir?" Morrison checked his watch. "You've got until 1600 hours. Captain Hayes needs this bird for tomorrow's mission. If you can't fix it by then, we're calling it a loss and cannibalizing it for parts." The words hit Tommy like a punch. Cannibalizing. It meant this beautiful machine would be stripped down, its parts scattered among other aircraft, its identity lost forever. Every mechanic knew that feeling. Watching a plane they'd worked on reduced to spare parts felt like a small death. "I'll fix it, sir," Tommy said, surprised by the certainty in his own voice. Morrison studied him for a moment, then nodded. "You were trained at Curtiss-Wright, weren't you?" "Yes, sir. Class of 42. Top of my group in engine mechanics." "Then you know these double wasps better than most. Good luck, Sergeant. You're going to need it." Morrison walked away, leaving Tommy alone with the silent Thunderbolt. Tommy grabbed his toolbox from the maintenance shed and set to work. He started with the basics, even though he knew the other mechanics had already been through these steps. In his experience, the solution to a mystery problem was often something simple that everyone had overlooked. He checked fuel flow, examined the magnetos, tested the mixture control, and inspected every connection he could reach. By noon, he'd found nothing. The engine still started perfectly, purred like a content tiger for exactly 5 minutes, then died as if someone had thrown a kill switch. Tommy sat on the wing, eating his sandwich without tasting it, his mind racing through possibilities. Electrical? No, they'd replaced everything. Fuel system? Already checked multiple times. Cooling issue? The temperature gauges showed normal readings during the 5 minutes of operation. As the afternoon sun climbed higher, Tommy felt the pressure mounting. The other mechanics had tried for 3 days. What made him think he could solve it in a few hours? But surrendering wasn't in his nature. His father, a craftsman who'd built furniture in Little Italy before the Depression, had taught him that every problem had a solution. You just had to be stubborn enough to find it. He climbed back into the cockpit, determined to try again. The ghost in the machine. Tommy sat in the cockpit, surrounded by instruments and switches that represented years of aviation engineering. The P-47's cockpit was spacious compared to other fighters, another reason pilots loved it, but right now it felt like a puzzle box with too many pieces and no picture to follow. He turned the ignition key. The massive 18-cylinder engine roared to life, its 2,000 horsepower vibrating through the airframe. The sound was magnificent, powerful, a symphony of precisely timed explosions contained within cylinders and channeled in a thrust. Tommy watched the instruments carefully, oil pressure rising normally, cylinder head temperature climbing steadily, fuel pressure holding steady at 14 pounds per square inch. 1 minute passed. 2 minutes. Everything normal. 3 minutes. Still purring perfectly. 4 minutes. Tommy leaned forward, anticipating the problem. At 4 minutes and 45 seconds, he felt it, a tiny stutter, almost imperceptible. Then another. The engine note changed slightly, dropping just a fraction. At 5 minutes exactly, the engine coughed twice and died, leaving only the clicking of cooling metal and Tommy's frustrated breathing. "What the hell?" he muttered, slamming his palm against the control panel. He climbed down and circled the aircraft, looking for anything, a loose panel, a disconnected wire, a fluid leak. Nothing. The P-47 sat there mocking him with its silence. Whatever was wrong happened internally, somewhere deep in the engine's 18 cylinders or in the maze of systems that fed it. Corporal Eddie Martinez approached from the maintenance shed, carrying a clipboard and a concerned expression. Eddie was from Texas, spoke with a thick accent, and had a gift for understanding electrical systems that bordered on supernatural. "Any luck, Tommy?" "None. It's like it's haunted. Runs perfect for exactly 5 minutes, then just quits." Eddie scratched his chin. "That's weird, man. Too consistent to be random. If it was a mechanical failure, it'd be more unpredictable. But 5 minutes on the dot. That's like it's timed or something." The word time stuck in Tommy's mind. Timed. When the engine system was time-dependent. Thermal expansion. But the engine wasn't reaching critical temperatures in 5 minutes. Fuel system vapor lock? No, that would be temperature-related too, and more erratic. "Eddie, help me pull the cowling. I want to look at the engine again." The two men worked quickly, removing the metal panels that covered the massive radial engine. The R-2800 Double Wasp was a marvel of engineering. 2 rows of 9 cylinders each, arranged in a circle around the central crankshaft. Each cylinder was a precisely machined piece of aluminum with steel cylinder walls, cooled by fins that gave the engine its distinctive ridged appearance. Tommy inspected every cylinder, every fuel line, every wire. He checked the supercharger, the device that forced more air into the engine at high altitude, giving the P-47 its impressive high-altitude performance. He examined the intercooler, the magnetos, the spark plug leads. Everything looked perfect. "Maybe it's the carburetor after all," Eddie suggested. "I know they already cleaned it, but what if there's something inside that comes loose after a few minutes of vibration?" It was worth checking. Tommy removed the carburetor, a complex device that mixed fuel and air in precisely the right proportions, and disassembled it completely on his workbench. He found nothing, no debris, no worn parts, no blockages. He reassembled it carefully and reinstalled it on the engine. Another test. Another 5 minutes of perfect operation. Another death. By 1400 hours, Tommy was running out of time and ideas. He sat on the tarmac beside the landing gear, his back against the massive tire, and closed his eyes. Sometimes his father had told him, you had to stop looking and start thinking. The answer was there. He just hadn't seen it yet. He mentally walked through the engine's operation. Fuel flowed from the tanks through lines to the carburetor. The carburetor mixed it with air. The mixture entered the cylinders. Spark plugs ignited it. Exhaust gases left through the exhaust system. The cycle repeated thousands of times per minute, perfectly synchronized by the crankshaft and camshaft. But what changed after 5 minutes? Something had to be changing. Something small enough that visual inspection missed it, but significant enough to kill the engine completely. "Tommy," Eddie called out. "Colonel Morrison wants an update." Tommy stood up, brushing dirt from his pants. He didn't have an update. He had nothing but a mystery that was defeating him. But he wasn't ready to give up yet. Not while there was still time on the clock. "Tell him I need another hour," Tommy called back. "I'm close to something." He wasn't, but saying it out loud made it feel more possible. Somewhere in this machine, a tiny component was failing, and he was going to find it, even if he had to take the entire engine apart piece by piece. Under pressure, Lieutenant Sarah Chun found Tommy still working on the P-47 at 1,500 hours. She was one of only 3 female mechanics on the base. having fought her way through prejudice and skepticism to prove she could handle aircraft maintenance as well as any man. She carried a metal tray with 2 cups of coffee and a sandwich. "You need to eat," she said, setting the tray on the workbench. "Can't fix planes if you collapse from hunger." Tommy accepted the coffee gratefully. "Thanks, Shun, but I don't think food is going to solve this one." "Talk it through with me," she suggested, leaning against the workbench. Fresh perspective might help. Tommy explained everything he'd tried, every test he'd run, every system he'd checked. Sarah listened carefully, occasionally asking questions that showed her deep understanding of aircraft engines. She'd grown up in her father's garage in San Francisco, learning mechanics before most girls her age learned to cook. "You said it dies at exactly 5 minutes every time?" she asked. "Like clockwork." "Well, like a clock that only runs for 5 minutes before breaking." Sarah smiled at his attempt at humor. "What if it's not the engine itself? What if it's something in the fuel system that's time-dependent? Not the carburetor or the lines, but something else?" "Like what?" "Fuel pressure. What if there's a regulator or valve somewhere that's failing after it heats up? Most of these components are designed to handle heat, but if one is defective..." Tommy straightened up. "Fuel pressure." He checked the pressure gauge, and it always showed normal readings. But what if the gauge was lying? What if there was a pressure issue downstream that the gauge couldn't detect? "The fuel pressure regulator," Tommy said, his mind racing. "It's supposed to maintain constant pressure to the carburetor. But what if it's out a leak? As it heats up, the leak could get worse, pressure drops below minimum, engine dies." "Exactly. And it would take a few minutes for the heat buildup to affect it." Tommy grabbed his tools and moved to the engine's fuel system. The fuel pressure regulator was a small component, easy to overlook, and it was located in a position where it would heat up quickly once the engine started. He disconnected the fuel lines carefully. Fuel was still present in the system, and he didn't want to create a fire hazard, and removed the regulator on his workbench. He examined it under bright light. The housing looked fine, but when he disassembled it, he found something, a hairline crack in the diaphragm, the rubber membrane that responded to pressure changes. It was so small he almost missed it, but it was there. "That's it," he exclaimed. "The diaphragm has a crack. When cold, it holds. When it heats up, the rubber expands, the crack opens wider, pressure bleeds off, and the engine starts for fuel." Sarah grinned. "I knew you'd find it. So we just need a replacement regulator." Tommy's excitement died as quickly as it had sparked. "Yeah, a replacement that we don't have." He walked to the parts storage shed, hoping against hope. The parts sergeant, a grizzled veteran named Murphy who'd been maintaining aircraft since biplanes were modern, shook his head before Tommy even finished asking. 47 fuel pressure regulators? Son, we've been waiting on a shipment for 6 weeks. I've got requisition orders stacked up. Your bird isn't the only one needing parts. There has to be something," Tommy insisted. "Can we modify a regulator from another aircraft type?" Murphy pulled out a thick manual and flipped through pages. 40 regulators are similar but run at different pressure. 38 uses a different system entirely. 25 bomber parts won't fit. I can put in an emergency requisition, but it'll take at least 3 days, maybe a week. 3 days. Captain Hayes needed the plane tomorrow. By the time the part arrived, the P-47 would already be stripped for parts, its mission reassigned, its potential wasted. Tommy walked back to the aircraft, the damaged regulator in his hand. It was such a small thing, no bigger than a pack of cigarettes, but it had defeated everyone. He thought about trying to repair the diaphragm somehow, maybe with rubber cement or a patch, but he knew it wouldn't hold under pressure and heat. The repair would fail, probably catastrophically, potentially mid-flight. "Can't you make something work?" Sarah asked, seeing his defeated expression. "Not without the right parts. And even if I could jury-rig something, I wouldn't trust it. Not with a pilot's life on the line." The sun was dropping toward the horizon. 1,600 hours came and went. Morrison appeared, his face set in grim lines. "Time's up, Sergeant." "Sir, I found the problem. It's the fuel pressure regulator. The diaphragm has a crack. Do you have a replacement?" "No, sir, but then we're done here. I'll have the crew start stripping the plane at 0600 tomorrow." "Good work finding the problem," Rizzo, at least we know what killed her. Morrison's voice carried a note of genuine regret. He was a pilot himself. He understood what it meant to lose an aircraft. Tommy stood beside the P-47 as Morrison walked away. Around him, the base was winding down for the evening. Mechanics were cleaning tools, pilots were heading to the mess hall, and the tropical night was beginning its rapid descent. In the distance, he could hear the ocean waves against the coral reef, that he wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. There had to be a way. Desperate measures. Tommy couldn't sleep that night. He lay in his bunk, staring at the mosquito netting overhead, his mind circling the problem like a fighter plane looking for an opening. The fuel pressure regulator's cracked diaphragm was the culprit. He was certain of that, but without a replacement part, he might as well have never found the problem at all. Around him, other mechanics snored or shifted in their sleep. Eddie Martinez muttered something in Spanish, probably dreaming of home. Through the screened windows, tropical insects sang their nightly chorus, and somewhere in the distance, a generator hummed steadily. At 0300 hours, Tommy gave up on sleep. He dressed quietly and walked to the maintenance hangar, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The guard on duty, a young private from Nebraska, nodded him through without question. Everyone knew Tommy was working on the impossible P-47 problem. The hangar was dark and cavernous, filled with the shapes of aircraft in various states of repair. Tommy made his way to his workbench where the damaged regulator sat like a small monument to failure. He picked it up, turning it over in his hands, studying it by flashlight. The diaphragm was the key. It needed to be flexible enough to respond to pressure changes, but strong enough to hold a seal. Rubber was the standard material, but rubber expanded when heated, which was exactly what had caused the crack to open. What he needed was something that wouldn't expand as much, or that would expand evenly without compromising the seal. He started going through bins of spare parts, looking for anything that might work. Gaskets, wrong material and wrong size. O-rings, too small and wrong shape. Sheet rubber might work if he could cut it precisely, but he doubted he could match the exact thickness and flexibility of the original. As the night wore on, frustration mounted. The problem wasn't just finding a replacement material. It was finding something that would work safely under the extreme conditions inside an aircraft engine. Pressures ranging from 10 to 20 pounds per square inch, temperatures from ambient to over 200 degrees Fahrenheit, vibrations that would shake loose any improvised fix, and fuel that would dissolve many adhesives and materials. By 0500 hours, the eastern sky was showing the first hints of dawn. Tommy heard sounds of the base waking up, distant voices, the clang of metal, the start of vehicle engines. Soon the stripping crew would arrive to begin dismantling the P-47. He walked outside, needing air and space to think. The morning was already warm, promising another scorching day. He wandered toward the mess hall, drawn by the smell of coffee and the need for human voices, even if they couldn't help him. The mess hall was starting to fill with early risers. Cooks were preparing breakfast, powdered eggs, Spam, toast, and precious real coffee. Tommy poured himself a cup and sat at a table alone, the damaged regulator still in his pocket like a talisman. "You look like hell, Rizzo," said a voice. Captain Frank Hayes slid into the seat across from him. Hayes was the pilot who was supposed to fly the P-47 on today's mission. He was a good pilot, careful but aggressive when needed, with 16 confirmed kills and a reputation for bringing his plane back no matter how shot up it got. "Couldn't fix your plane, Captain. Sorry." Hayes waved it off. "I heard you found the problem, though. That's more than anyone else managed. Sometimes the parts just aren't there, and there's nothing you can do about it. They're reassigning me to fly Kowalski's P-47. It's a good bird. It's not the same, though, is it? Every plane has its own personality." Hayes smiled. "You mechanics always say that. But yeah, you're right. I had 6 missions in that Thunderbolt. She brought me home every time. Would have liked to keep that streak going." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, two men who understood the strange relationship between human and machine, the way a good aircraft became more than just metal and rivets. What exactly was wrong with it? Hayes asked. Tommy pulled out the regulator and explained the problem. The cracked diaphragm, The way heat made it worse, the pressure drop that starved the engine. Hayes listened with interest, asking intelligent questions. Most pilots knew their aircraft's systems well. Their lives depended on it. And there's no way to patch it? Not that would be safe. The rubber is too degraded, and any patch would just fail under the pressure and heat. What I need is a replacement diaphragm made of something that won't crack with heat expansion. Hayes stared at the small device thoughtfully. When I was a kid, my dad was a plumber. He used to fix leaks in pipes by cutting shapes from old tires and using them as gaskets. Said tire rubber was tougher than the regular stuff because it had to handle temperature changes and stress. Any chance that would work here? Tommy turned the idea over in his mind. Tire rubber was indeed more heat-resistant than standard rubber, reinforced with steel belts and designed to handle extreme stress. But finding a piece of tire rubber in the right thickness, cutting it to exact specifications, and installing it in the regulator would be delicate work. And even if he succeeded, there was no guarantee it would work or that it would be safe. It's worth a try, Tommy said slowly. If it fails, the worst that happens is the engine dies again. We're already scrapping the plane anyway. That's the spirit, Hayes said with a grin. Let me know if you need help. About a few hours before my flight briefing, Tommy finished his coffee and headed to the vehicle depot where old tires were stockpiled for various purposes. The sun was fully up now, turning the Pacific sky brilliant blue. He had maybe an hour before the stripping crew arrived. 1 hour to perform a miracle. The morning mess. Tommy found what he needed in the depot, a badly worn tire from a Jeep, with rubber exposed where the tread had completely worn away. He cut a section free with his knife and hurried back to the hangar. The rubber was thicker than the original diaphragm, which meant he'd need to shave it down carefully to match the precise specifications. Sarah Chan was already at the workbench when he arrived, apparently having heard through the rumor mill that he was attempting something desperate. "You gonna try make a new diaphragm?" she asked, examining the chunk of tire rubber. "Yeah, crazy, right?" "Completely. But so is giving up." She pulled out her own set of precision tools. "Let me help." For hands are better than two. They worked quickly, measuring the original diaphragm's thickness with a micrometer, exactly 0.062 inches. Tommy used a sharp blade to carefully shave the tire rubber down, checking measurements every few passes. The material was tough, resistant to cutting, which was actually a good sign. If it could resist his blade, it might resist cracking under pressure. Eddie Martinez joined them at 0630, followed by 2 other mechanics who'd heard what was happening. Word spread fast in a military base. Soon Tommy had a small audience of mechanics and even a few pilots, all watching him work on the tiny component that might save the P-47. "Stripping crew's been delayed," Eddie reported. "Morrison want to check on another plane first. You might have an extra 30 minutes. 30 minutes. Tommy's hands were sweating despite the morning cool. He worked slowly, carefully, knowing that one wrong cut would ruin everything. The tire rubber had to be exactly the right thickness, exactly the right diameter, and it had to flex properly without cracking or tearing. At 0700, he had something that looked right. The new diaphragm was cut from the tire rubber, shaved to the correct thickness, and fitted perfectly into the regulator housing. But looking right and working right were 2 very different things. "Only one way to find out," Tommy said. He reassembled the regulator, working carefully to ensure all the seals were tight and all the parts aligned correctly. His hands were steady despite his racing heart. Years of training took over, turning complex assembly into almost automatic movements. Sarah had already prepared the fuel lines. Together, they installed the modified regulator back into the P-47's engine. Tommy tightened each fitting to exact specifications, double-checking everything. A fuel leak could cause a fire. An incorrect installation could make the pressure problem worse instead of better. At 0730, Colonel Morrison arrived with the stripping crew. He stopped when he saw Tommy still working on the engine. "Sergeant Rizzo, I thought I made myself clear. Sir, I've got a possible fix. Request permission to test it." Morrison's jaw tightened. "I don't have time for long shots, Sergeant. We need to get parts from this bird to other aircraft that—" "5 minutes, sir," Tommy interrupted, which was a breach of protocol, but he was beyond caring. Just give me 5 minutes to test it. If it works, you've got a combat-ready P-47. If it doesn't, you've lost 5 minutes. Morrison looked at the gathering crowd of personnel, all watching to see what he'd decide. Tommy saw the calculation in his eyes. The value of maintaining morale versus the practical need to keep other aircraft flying. 5 minutes, Morrison said finally. But if that engine dies, we're done. Clear. Crystal clear, sir. Tommy climbed into the cockpit, his heart pounding. Behind him, he could hear the murmur of voices, people placing bets on whether his jury-rigged fix would work. He went through the startup sequence, his hands moving automatically through checks he'd performed hundreds of times. The key turned. The massive engine coughed once and roared to life. The sound was beautiful, powerful, perfect. Tommy watched the instruments. Oil pressure rising, cylinder head temperature climbing, fuel pressure holding steady at 14 psi. The modified regulator was working, at least initially. 1 minute passed. The engine purred steadily. 2 minutes. Still perfect. 3 minutes. Tommy realized he was holding his breath and forced himself to breathe normally. For minutes. This was where it usually started to stutter. Tommy watched the fuel pressure gauge like a hawk, ready for any sign of failure. For minutes, 30 seconds. Still running strong. For minutes, 45 seconds. The critical moment approached. Tommy's knuckles were white on the control stick. 5 minutes. The engine kept running. 5 minutes, 30 seconds. Still running. 6 minutes. 7 minutes. 10 minutes. The engine ran perfectly. Its 2,000 horsepower ready to push the Thunderbolt through the sky at over 400 miles per hour. Tommy let it run for 15 minutes total, then shut it down according to proper procedure. The sudden silence felt enormous. He climbed out of the cockpit and found every person in the hangar staring at him. Morrison approached, his expression unreadable. "Sergeant, what exactly did you do?" Tommy explained the cracked diaphragm, the missing parts, and his desperate substitution of tire rubber for the original material. Morrison listened, occasionally nodding, his engineering background allowing him to understand the technical details. "That's a field modification made with unauthorized materials," Morrison said slowly. Tommy's heart sank. He was about to be chewed out for breaking regulations. And it's also brilliant improvisation under impossible circumstances. Morrison turned to Captain Hayes. "Captain, are you willing to fly this aircraft with a non-standard repair?" Hayes didn't hesitate. "Absolutely, sir. I trust Sergeant Rizzo's work." "Then congratulations, Sergeant. You just saved yourself a P-47 Thunderbolt. Get this plane fueled and armed. Captain Hayes has a mission to fly." The hangar erupted in cheers and applause. Mechanics clapped Tommy on the back. Pilots shook his hand, and Sarah Chin hugged him briefly before remembering military decorum. Even Morrison allowed himself a small smile before walking away to handle the administrative headaches Tommy's unconventional repair would create. Eddie Martinez grabbed Tommy's shoulders. "Man, I can't believe you pulled it off. Tire rubber in a fuel regulator? That's insane." Tommy grinned, the exhaustion and stress of the past hours finally catching up with him. Sometimes you gotta work with what you've got. But even as he accepted congratulations, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered a worry. The engine had run for 15 minutes on the ground. But what would happen in combat conditions, high altitude, extreme temperatures, violent maneuvers, and the stress of combat flight? Would his makeshift repair hold? Or had he just sent Captain Hayes up in a plane that might fail at the worst possible moment? He pushed the thought away. The repair was sound. It would hold. It had to. Test flight and trouble. By 0900 hours, the P-47 was fueled, armed, and ready for its mission. Tommy had personally supervised every step of the preparation, checking and double-checking every system. The ground crew had loaded 4.50 caliber machine guns with ammunition, attached 2 500-pound bombs under the wings, and topped off the fuel tanks. The Thunderbolt sat on the tarmac, looking eager to fly. Captain Hayes performed his pre-flight walk-around, inspecting control surfaces, checking for fluid leaks, and ensuring everything was secure. Tommy stood nearby, fighting the urge to tell Hayes everything to watch for, everything that could go wrong. But Hayes was an experienced pilot. He knew his aircraft. "She looks good, Rizzo," Hayes called out. "You did good work. Just bring her back in one piece, sir." Hayes grinned. That's always the plan. Tommy watched as Hayes climbed into the cockpit and strapped himself in. The crew chief gave the signal, and Hayes started the engine. The R-2800 roared to life again, its familiar thunder rattling through Tommy's chest. Hayes let it warm up for the proper interval, running through his cockpit checks while the engine temperature stabilized. The radio crackled. "Thunderbolt 27, you are cleared for takeoff." "Roger, tower." "Thunderbolt 27 rolling." The P-47 began its takeoff run, quickly gathering speed on the coral-surfaced runway. The tail lifted, and then the main wheels left the ground. The Thunderbolt climbed into the brilliant blue sky, turning northwest toward its patrol sector. Tommy watched until it was just a speck in the distance, then turned back to his other work. But he couldn't focus. Every few minutes, he found himself looking at the sky, listening for engines, waiting for word. Sarah noticed and brought him busy work, routine maintenance tasks that needed doing but didn't require much thought. "He'll be fine," she said. "Your repair is solid. I saw the workmanship." "I know, but knowing and feeling are different things." The mission was supposed to last 4 hours, fly to the patrol sector, escort a group of bombers hitting Japanese supply lines, and return. For hours that felt like forever. Tommy tried to work on other aircraft, but his heart wasn't in it. He'd staked his reputation on a modification made from tire rubber in desperation. If Hayes went down because of a mechanical failure, at 1,230 hours, Eddie came running from the radio shack. "Tommy," Hayes radioed in. "The engine's running rough." Tommy's stomach dropped. "How rough?" He's not sure. Says it developed a vibration about halfway through the mission. He dropped out of formation, but he's staying airborne. Says the engine's still producing power, but something's not right. This was exactly what Tommy had feared. The tire rubber diaphragm had seemed like such a clever solution on the ground, but in the air with altitude changes and combat stress, something had gone wrong. He grabbed his toolkit and ran toward the runway, where emergency crews were already gathering. "What's his ETA?" Tommy asked the crew chief. 15 minutes. He's coming in solo. Bombers continued on at target with other escorts. 15 minutes. Tommy paced, his mind racing through possibilities. If the regulator was failing again, Hayes would lose fuel pressure and the engine would die. But Hayes said it was still producing power, just with a vibration. That meant something else was wrong, something Tommy hadn't anticipated. The minutes crawled by. Then Tommy heard it, the distinctive sound of a P-47 engine, but wrong somehow. The note was off, irregular, like a drumbeat with a syncopation error. Every mechanic on the field heard it and winced. That sound meant trouble. The P-47 appeared from the northeast, coming in lower and slower than normal. Hayes was keeping the engine at reduced power, trying to minimize whatever problem had developed. The landing gear deployed normally. At least the hydraulics were working. The flaps came down. Hayes lined up on the runway. The landing was smooth despite the rough engine. As soon as the wheels touched coral, Hayes cut the power and let the plane roll to a stop. Emergency vehicles raced after it, but Hayes was already climbing out of the cockpit, pulling off his helmet and oxygen mask. Tommy reached the plane first. "Captain, what happened?" Hayes looked shaken but unhurt. Started about 2 hours in. Felt like the engine was missing a beat, then it developed this vibration. I checked all the gauges, everything looked normal, oil pressure, fuel pressure, temperatures, but something was definitely wrong. It got worse when I increased power, better when I throttled back. Tommy was already climbing up to look at the engine. He popped the cowling panels and immediately saw the problem. One of the exhaust stacks had a crack near its mounting point, and exhaust gases were escaping, creating a blowtorch effect that had scorched the cowling. The vibration Hayes felt was from the uneven exhaust pressure affecting one cylinder. "It's not the regulator," Tommy said, relief flooding through him. "One of your exhaust stacks cracked. Probably a fatigue failure that just happened to show up during this flight." Hayes climbed up to look, and his face broke into a smile. "So your rubber tire modification worked fine?" "Looks like it. The exhaust stack is a completely separate issue. Thank God. I was worried I'd have to tell you your brilliant fix failed. Morrison arrived, summoned by the emergency landing. Tommy explained the situation, showed him the cracked exhaust stack, and reassured him that the fuel system modification was still functioning perfectly. Can you fix the exhaust stack? Morrison asked. Yes, sir. We got spares. I can have it replaced in 2 hours. Make it 1 hour. Captain Hayes needs to get back up for the afternoon patrol. Tommy and his crew worked quickly, removing the damaged exhaust stack and installing a new one. While they worked, Hayes sat in the shade drinking water and recounting the mission to other pilots. The bombers had hit their targets successfully, Japanese positions had been strafed, and everyone had made it back safely. At 1,400 hours, the repair was complete. Hayes did another pre-flight check, started the engine, and this time it purred perfectly with no vibration. He took off for the afternoon patrol, and Tommy finally allowed himself to relax. Your modification held up, Sarah said, appearing at his elbow. Even through combat stress and altitude changes. That's impressive. It was just tire rubber, Tommy said, but he was grinning. It was problem-solving under pressure. That's what makes a good mechanic great. The rest of the day passed without incident. Hayes completed his afternoon patrol and landed without issues. The P-47's engine continued to run perfectly, the tire rubber diaphragm holding steady under all conditions. Word of Tommy's improvised fix spread through the base, and by evening mess, he was something of a celebrity. But Tommy knew the real test was still coming. One day a flight was good, but aircraft needed to be reliable over weeks and months. Would his modification last? Or would it fail spectacularly when least expected? Only time would tell. The fork. 3 weeks passed, and the P-47 with Tommy's modified fuel regulator flew daily missions without problems. Captain Hayes had come to trust the aircraft completely, logging over 40 hours of flight time, including 2 dogfights with Japanese Zeros, both of which he won, adding to his kill count. The success of the tire rubber diaphragm had even drawn attention from headquarters. An engineering officer arrived from Hawaii to inspect Tommy's modification and write a detailed report. If the fix proved reliable, it might be approved as a field modification for other aircraft facing similar problems with part shortages. Tommy had settled into a comfortable routine, maintaining multiple aircraft and mentoring newer mechanics. The tropical heat was still oppressive, the food was still mediocre, and the war still raged, but he'd found a rhythm. He'd even written home to his father, describing the fuel regulator problem and solution in careful terms that wouldn't violate security regulations. His father had written back expressing pride that Tommy was using the problem-solving skills he'd learned in the furniture shop. But on a Tuesday morning in early July, a new problem emerged. "Tommy, you better come look at this," Eddie Martinez said, his face worried. Tommy followed Eddie to the maintenance hangar where a different P-47 sat with its cowling removed. This one belonged to Lieutenant Davis, a quiet pilot from Oregon who'd been flying regular patrols without incident. But now the engine's ignition harness, the system of wires that carried electrical current to the spark plugs, was exposed, and Tommy immediately saw the problem. The harness was a mess. Wires were frayed, insulation was cracked and peeling, and several connection points showed signs of arcing. Electrical discharge that could cause misfires or even fires. The harness was failing from age, heat, and vibration, and it needed to be replaced before Davis flew again. "How bad?" Tommy asked. "Bad enough that I wouldn't trust it for another flight. We need a new harness." Tommy went to parts supply and had the conversation he was dreading. Murphy, the parts sergeant, pulled out his records and shook his head. "Ignition harnesses? I've been waiting on those for 2 months. Supply chain is stretched thin everywhere. I can requisition one, but it'll take at least 3 weeks, maybe longer." 3 weeks meant Davis's plane would be grounded, which meant 1 fewer aircraft for missions, which meant more strain on the other planes and pilots. The P-47 was critical to the war effort in the Pacific, and every grounded plane was a loss they couldn't afford. "Can we repair the existing harness?" Tommy asked. Murphy shrugged. "Maybe temporarily, but those wires are cooked. You might get a few more flights out of it, but it's risky. Tommy returned to the hangar and examined the harness more carefully. The main problem was the wire insulation, the rubber coating that prevented the high-voltage wires from shorting against the metal engine. Heat and vibration had degraded the insulation until it was brittle and cracking. The copper wire underneath was fine, but exposed wire in an engine was a disaster waiting to happen. We need to insulate these wires somehow, Tommy said. Something that can handle high voltage and high temperature. What about electrical tape? Eddie suggested. Won't hold up to engine heat. It'll melt or degrade, just like the original insulation. They tried various materials over the next few hours, different types of tape, rubber tubing, even fabric wrapping. Nothing worked. Everything either couldn't handle the voltage, couldn't handle the heat, or was too bulky to fit in the tight spaces around the engine. By afternoon, Tommy was frustrated and running out of ideas. He sat in the mess hall, picking at a dinner of Spam and canned vegetables, the ignition harness problem turning over and over in his mind. Sarah Chun sat across from him, eating in silence, sensing his mood. Tommy mechanically lifted a forkful of Spam, but the meat fell off the fork before reaching his mouth. The fork was bent, damage from rough handling by mess workers, or the result of too many meals served to too many hungry servicemen. He was about to get a replacement when something made him pause. He looked at the fork more carefully. It was steel, cheap military-issue flatware, but the tines were thin and the handle had been bent at an angle. The bent section formed almost a tube shape where the handle had been compressed. "Chun," he said slowly, "what if we don't need to insulate the wires?" "What do you mean?" "The bare copper can't touch the engine." "Right, but what if we keep the wires away from the engine? Like spacers. Something that holds the wires at a distance so they can't touch metal even if the insulation fails." Sarah thought about it. That could work. But what would you make spacers from? They'd need to be non-conductive, heat-resistant, and the right shape. Tommy held up the bent fork. "What about these?" He explained his idea. Cut the fork tines to length, bend them into small loops, and use them as standoffs to keep the ignition wires separated from the engine. The steel would handle the heat. The loops would prevent the wires from touching metal, and it would be easy to install. "That's either brilliant or crazy," Sarah said. "Let's find out which." They returned to the hangar with a handful of damaged forks from the mess hall. The cook was happy to get rid of bent and worn flatware. Tommy selected a fork with good spring to its tines and used metal snips to cut the tines into inch-long sections. He bent each section into a small loop using pliers, creating crude but functional standoffs. Working carefully, he attached the fork tine loops along the ignition harness, spacing them every few inches. Each loop held the wire away from the engine surface by about a quarter inch, enough clearance that even if the insulation failed completely, the bare copper wouldn't touch metal and create a short circuit. Eddie watched with fascination. "Man, you really think that'll work?" Only one way to find out. They reinstalled the modified harness and started the engine. It fired up normally, all 18 cylinders running smooth. Tommy let it run for 20 minutes while monitoring for any signs of misfiring or electrical problems. Everything looked perfect. "I'll be damned," Murphy said, having come to watch the test. Fork tines as electrical standoffs. That's the craziest thing I've seen work. Lieutenant Davis came by that evening to check on his plane and nearly laughed when Tommy explained the modification. "You're keeping my ignition wires safe with mess hall forks?" "Just the tines, sir." "But yes." Davis shook his head in amazement. "You mechanics are something else." If it works, I guess." The next day, Davis flew a full mission without problems. The fork tine standoffs held perfectly, keeping the degraded wires from shorting even under the vibration and heat of combat flight. More importantly, the modification bought them time. The wires could continue functioning for weeks or months until proper replacement harnesses arrived. Word of the fork modification spread even faster than the tire rubber diaphragm story. Soon Tommy had mechanics from other squadrons coming by to ask about the technique. Within a week, several other aircraft with aging ignition harnesses had been modified using fork tines as standoffs. Colonel Morrison called Tommy to his office. "Sergeant Rizzo, you've had quite a month. Tire rubber and fuel regulators, fork tines and ignition harnesses. What's next?" Shoelaces in the hydraulic system. Only if necessary, sir, Tommy replied, unsure if Morrison was praising or reprimanding him. Morrison's stern face broke into a smile. You saved us 3 aircraft this month with improvised repairs that shouldn't work, but do. That's the kind of mechanical thinking we need out here. Command is recommending you for a commendation. Thank you, sir, but I was just doing my job. Your job is to maintain aircraft. Finding creative solutions when the proper parts don't exist, that's above and beyond your job. Good work, Sergeant. As Tommy left the colonel's office, he reflected on the strange path that had brought him here. A furniture maker's son from New York, fixing fighter planes on a Pacific island with tire rubber and eating utensils. His father had been right. Every problem had a solution if you were stubborn enough to find it. But the war wasn't over, and Tommy knew there would be more problems ahead. More aircraft needing repairs, more parts that weren't available, more impossible situations requiring creative thinking. He was ready for them. After all, if he could fix an engine with a broken fork, what couldn't he do? Legacy of the Broken Fork. August 1945 brought news that would change everything. Japan had surrendered. The war was over. The base erupted in celebration. Pilots and mechanics dancing on the tarmac, hugging each other, firing flares into the sky. Years of fear and loss and constant danger were suddenly over. They would go home. They would see their families. They would live without the daily threat of death from above or below. Tommy stood beside his workbench, watching the celebration through the open hangar doors. He felt relief, certainly, and joy that no more young men would die in the cockpits of planes he maintained. But there was also a strange melancholy. This work had defined his life for 3 years. These aircraft, these problems, these impossible repairs, they'd shaped who he'd become. Captain Hayes found him there, still in his flight suit from what would turn out to be his final combat mission, a patrol that had turned into a victory lap when the surrender news arrived. Rizzo, why aren't you celebrating? Just thinking, sir. It's a lot to process. Hayes sat on the workbench beside him. You know, I flew 47 missions in that P-47 after you fixed the fuel regulator. 47 times, I trusted my life to your tire rubber modification. Never failed once. I'm glad, sir. More than glad, Sergeant. I'm alive because you were stubborn enough to keep trying when everyone else had given up. That modification you made, headquarters approved it as a field standard. It's going into the official maintenance manuals. Dozens of other P-47s got the same fix based on your work. Tommy hadn't known that. Really? And the fork-tying trick for ignition harnesses? Same thing. You created solutions that are now standard procedure. That's a hell of a legacy. After Hayes left to join the celebration, Sarah Chun appeared with 2 bottles of warm beer she'd acquired from somewhere. To the end of the war, she said, handing him one. They clinked bottles and drank. The beer was terrible, warm and stale, but it was the best Tommy had ever tasted. What are you going to do after? Sarah asked. After we're discharged? Go back to New York, I guess. Maybe work in a garage or a factory. Use these skills I've learned. Engineering school. I want to design aircraft, not just fix them. These years have taught me I'm good at this. You're better than good, Chun. They talked into the evening, reminiscing about the aircraft they'd saved, the problems they'd solved, the improvised repairs that had kept pilots flying. The celebration continued around them, but they were content to observe it from the quiet sanctuary of the hangar. 3 months later, Tommy received his discharge papers. He was going home. The base was already being wound down, aircraft being mothballed or shipped to other locations, personnel being rotated back to the States. The war machine was being disassembled. Before he left, Tommy walked to the tarmac one last time. The P-47 he'd saved with tire rubber and determination sat there, waiting for its own journey to wherever surplus military aircraft went. He ran his hand along the fuselage, feeling the warm metal under his palm. You were a good bird, he said softly. You brought Hayes home every time. In his pocket was the original cracked fuel regulator diaphragm. He'd kept it as a souvenir. Wrapped with it was one of the bent fork tines he'd used on Davis's ignition harness. Small things. Broken things. Things that shouldn't have been able to save multi-ton aircraft worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. But they had. The trip home took 2 weeks, sailing across the Pacific on a transport ship crowded with jubilant servicemen. Tommy spent the voyage on deck, watching the ocean pass, thinking about everything that had happened. He'd left New York as a mechanic in training. He was returning as a master of improvisation, someone who'd learned that solutions existed in the most unlikely places if you were creative enough to see them. New York Harbor appeared on a gray November morning. The Statue of Liberty looked smaller than Tommy remembered, or maybe he'd just grown larger in experience and confidence. The ship docked, families waited on the pier, and Tommy descended the gangplank into the America he'd fought to preserve. His father met him at the dock, older and grayer, but still strong. They embraced without words, the kind of hug that communicated everything that letters had left unsaid. That night, over dinner at the small apartment in Little Italy, Tommy told his father about the P-47, about the fuel regulator problem, about the tire rubber and the forked tines, and all the impossible repairs that had kept aircraft flying and pilots alive. His father listened, nodding occasionally, a proud smile on his face. "You remember what I taught you," the old man said when Tommy finished. "Every problem has a solution. You just have to be stubborn enough to find it." I remembered, "Papa," every day. And you remembered something else too. The best tools aren't always the expensive ones or the fancy ones. Sometimes the best tool is whatever's at hand, if you're clever enough to use it right. Tommy thought about that, about tire rubber and forked tines and all the improvised solutions he'd created from materials nobody else thought could work. His father was right. The best repairs weren't always by the book. Sometimes they required looking at broken things and seeing possibilities instead of just failures. Years later, Tommy would open his own garage in Brooklyn. The sign over the door read, "Rizzo and Sons Automotive Repair. No job too difficult." He became known throughout the borough as the mechanic who could fix anything, who would find solutions when other mechanics gave up. And on his desk, in a small frame, he kept 2 items: a cracked rubber diaphragm from a fuel pressure regulator and a bent fork tine. Souvenirs from a war that had taught him the value of creativity, persistence, and seeing potential in broken things. Sometimes younger mechanics would ask about the strange items in the frame. "What are those?" they'd ask. And Tommy would smile and tell them the story of the P-47 that couldn't fly, the fuel regulator that couldn't be fixed, and the impossible repair made from tire rubber and determination. He'd tell them about Captain Hayes and Sarah Chun and Colonel Morrison. He'd tell them about learning to look at problems sideways, about refusing to accept impossible as an answer. But mostly, he'd tell them about the broken fork, about seeing a bent piece of cheap military flatware and recognizing it as a solution to an electrical problem. Because that was the lesson that mattered most. Solutions existed everywhere, in everything, if you were creative enough and stubborn enough to find them. Never give up on a problem, he'd tell the young mechanics. And never assume that the answer has to come from the parts catalog. Sometimes the solution is sitting right there on your lunch tray, waiting for you to notice it. The young mechanics would nod, maybe understanding, maybe thinking the old man was just telling war stories. But some of them, the best of them, would absorb the lesson. They'd learn to look at broken things and see possibilities. They'd learn that being a great mechanic wasn't just about following manuals. It was about creative problem solving, about persistence, about refusing to accept defeat. And sometimes, late at night when the garage was closed and Tommy was alone with his memories, he'd take the framed items down from the shelf. He'd hold the cracked diaphragm and the forked tine in his hands, feeling their weight, remembering the pressure and fear and eventual triumph of those days in the Pacific. The war had taken much from Tommy's generation, but it had also taught them lessons about resilience, creativity, and the unexpected value of looking at old problems in new ways. These were lessons Tommy carried his entire life, lessons he passed on to everyone who learned the mechanic's trade under his guidance. The story of the P-47's engine and the broken fork became something of a legend in aviation maintenance circles. Even decades later, Air Force instructors teaching aircraft maintenance would tell the story as an example of field ingenuity. The tire rubber modification remained in maintenance manuals as an authorized field repair until the P-47 was retired from service. But for Tommy, the The story was never about fame or recognition. It was about doing the job, solving the problem, and keeping pilots safe. It was about his father's lessons applied to aircraft engines instead of furniture. It was about proving that creativity mattered as much as training, that determination could overcome resource shortages, and that sometimes the best solutions came from the most unexpected places. The P-47 Thunderbolt was a magnificent machine, powerful, reliable, capable. But it took mechanics like Tommy Rizzo to keep them flying when parts ran short and problems seemed impossible. It took people who looked at broken forks and saw solutions, who refused to give up when manuals offered no answers, who understood that ingenuity was as important as inventory. Tommy lived a long life, saw grandchildren and great-grandchildren, watched aviation evolve from propeller fighters to jet aircraft to spacecraft. But he never forgot those months in the Pacific when a cracked diaphragm and a bent fork taught him the most important lesson of his career, that the human element, creativity, persistence, and lateral thinking, was worth more than any parts catalog. The framed item stayed on his desk until the day he died, a quiet reminder of what could be accomplished when giving up wasn't an option and creativity was the only tool that mattered. And somewhere, in the vast storage facilities where military history is preserved, a detailed maintenance report still exists. Filed in August 1944, written in Tommy Rizzo's careful handwriting, it describes a fuel pressure regulator repair using vulcanized tire rubber as a diaphragm replacement. The report was marked, approved for field use, and signed by Colonel James Morrison. Paperclipped to that report is a handwritten note from Morrison. Sergeant Rizzo's modification demonstrates exceptional mechanical knowledge and creative problem-solving under combat conditions. Recommend commendation for sustained superior performance and innovation. It's a small piece of history, tucked away in archives that few people will ever see. But it represents something larger. The ingenuity of ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges, the value of looking at problems from unexpected angles, and the triumph of determination over impossible odds. That's the legacy of the broken fork. Not just a clever repair, but a reminder that solutions exist everywhere if we're persistent enough to find them and creative enough to recognize them.